Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Story Corner Adventures. Today we are going to be reading Chapter 7 of The Wheel on the School from Meindert Dejong. Now, before we begin Chapter 7, which is called Auke and the Tin Man, there are a few things that we need to know for sure. So, about the only visual you're going to need from outside here is just a reminder of what the parts of the wheel are, because you'll find that the outer rim of a wheel features pretty importantly in this chapter. The second thing you're going to need to know is something about a peddler. A peddler is a person who goes from house to house selling things. They used to be very common back when people often worked from home as a homemaker or a farmer, or they had other reasons to be home, and there was a possibility of going from home to home selling things. To give you an example, Janos's wife, mentioned in chapter 5, was a peddler. She would go from house to house selling bread. That way nobody would have to go to a store to buy bread. The bread would come to you. So you'll need to know what a peddler is in this chapter. The last thing to think of before we begin this chapter is about Auke himself. What do we know about Auke? Well, he's one of the boys of the school. He doesn't have a brother attending school. He's not the tallest, he's not the strongest, but we do recall that they mentioned that he is a good everyday boy, a nice everyday boy. You could be friends with him. So as you listen to this chapter, I just want you to think about that a little bit. What is it that makes Auke such a good friend? Alrighty, Auke and the Tin Man. Auke had been given the dike road to search. The dike road led to the village of Ness. With Lena on top of the dike and Auke on the road below, it was pleasant going for a while. They shouted back and forth to each other. From the dike, Lena was supposed to spy out the little side roads and lanes that led to the back farms lying off the main roads. "I'm going all the way to Ness," Auke shouted up at her. "Maybe even all through Ness." "Wish I could go with you," Lena called back enviously. "Why?" "Oh, those back farms sometimes have great big watchdogs, and I'm scared of dogs." They won't hurt you," Auke assured her. "Just look them straight in the eye and keep walking right up to them." "Which eye?" Lena asked from the top of the dike. She giggled nervously. "You want me to take the side roads and you take my road to Ness?" Auke offered. "No, I guess not," Lena called back doubtfully. "There are more houses on your road, and the more houses, the more dogs. At least from the dike, I can spy out if there's a dog in the yard and he's alone, and if there are people around. I'll just go singing all the way down those lanes and so the dogs can hear me coming." "You mean you don't want to take them by surprise and maybe scare them half to death?" Auke teased. Lena made a face at him. On the road below the dike, Auke reached the first farmhouse. The house stood at a curve in the dike road. From there, the road turned away from the sea and the dike to the inland village of Ness. Ness had trees, and Ness had storks. Auke was anxious to get there. When Auke reappeared from his search of the yard and the barns, Lena was nowhere in sight. Later, when Auke passed a narrow lane, he heard faint singing around a curve. It must be Lena. Auke barked hoarsely. Lena heard him through her singing. He could hear her laugh nervously. "Hope you find a dozen wheels and no dogs," Auke shouted to the unseen Lena. Then he hurried on. Auke was nearing Ness at last. His trip so far had been fruitless. Not a farm had a wheel to spare. Across a flat field, the roofs of Ness among green trees blinked warm and red in the sun. Auke rested a while on the side of the road near a narrow dirt lane, hoping that Lena might be down that lane. He listened in the country quiet for any sound of singing. A thin, rattling, jangling sound came to his ears from the depths of the bush-lined lane. Auke listened and grinned. It must be Lena. She must have grown tired of singing and must be rattling something now to warn the dogs of her approach. The faint jangling noise seemed to be drawing closer. It was hard to tell. It kept stopping and then starting up again. Now it had stopped. After a long silence, the jangling began again and drew steadily closer. At last Auke thought he knew what it was. It must be the tinware peddler, with shiny tinny pots and pans and kettles hanging from hooks and wires all over his wagon. It was the Tin Man. Down the narrow lane, a skinny old horse came slowly into sight, and behind him was the jangling wagon. But there was no one on the seat. One side of the wagon was completely off the road, riding in the roadside grass. It must be that the old horse had decided to go home and had left the Tin Man behind at some farm. The wagon stopped, and Auke saw the Tin Man come around the back of the wagon. He fussed with the back wheel that had been riding in the grass. Auke waited. At last the Tin Man mounted the high seat, and the wagon came on again. The old wagon came grinding and rattling out of the lane. It made a wide, careful turn into the road where Auke was standing. The hub of the wheel almost grazed Auke, but still the Tin Man had not noticed him. The man sat twisted in the seat, his eyes fixed on the back wheel of the wagon. Auke looked at the wheel. "Hey, your rim is coming off!" The Tin Man, startled, saw Auke and hastily stopped his horse. "Your wheel! It's coming apart!" Auke yelled at him again. "Yes, I know," the man said morosely. "I've been holding the rim in place with wires all the way from Shora, but the wires wear through so soon. Then I have to twist new ones around the rim again to hold it on the wheel." He climbed down wearily, hunted a wire out of the back of his wagon, and wrapped it around the rim. There were wires twisted around the whole rim every few inches. Why don't you give me the wheel?" Auke suddenly said. "It's no good." "That's a funny thing to say," the Tin Man said reprovingly. "Give it to you? And what am I supposed to do then? Ride home on the axle?" Auke realized he'd been abrupt in blurting out his odd demand. He hastily explained to the Tin Man the stork plans the school had for Shora, and the need for a wheel. "Well, there's no doubt that's all it's good for, storks," the Tin Man said. "But I'm going to need it until I get another wheel. As soon as I get to Ness, I'm just going to have to get another one, that's sure." "Oh, then may I go with you?" Auke asked eagerly. "I'm going to Ness too. Then when you get the new wheel, and if I could have the old one, it would be fine for storks," he explained earnestly. "It doesn't have to roll for storks, and storks wouldn't mind a few wires, just so they don't catch their toes in them." Not so fast, the Tin Man said. "I need a new wheel. I've got to get a new wheel, but how I'm going to get one is something else again. It's been a sorry week. All I did was patch a few pots and pans on my route. Hardly a soul bought anything new. In that whole dump of Shora, only that legless fellow bought some scrap pieces of tin. Said he wanted to hang them in a tree. But that's all I sold in Shora." "Oh, that was Janus," Auke said. "They're to scare the birds out of his cherry tree." His eyes brightened. "Hey, that must mean the cherries are going to start to turn red." The Tin Man didn't listen, but clucked the old horse ahead a few steps. He carefully studied the turning wheel. Even the spaced wires weren't keeping the outer metal rim in place on the wooden rim of the wheel. In a few turnings of the wheel, the wires stretched and allowed the outer rim to run almost halfway off the wheel. When the wheel turned, the iron rim sort of wobbled beside the wooden rim that it was supposed to cover. The man surveyed the gravel road. "You can see the roofs of nests," he said hopelessly, "but on that gravel, I'll be winding wires so much it'll be dark before I get there." "If I got on the back of the wagon, and the moment I saw a wire giving out, I quickly twisted on another wire," Alka suggested, "then you wouldn't have to stop and get out and get down all the time." "Well," the man said, "that's an idea. That way we might both get to nests. But remember, I can't promise you that wheel." He handed Alka a handful of short pieces of wire and helped boost him into the high wagon. Tinware was hanging everywhere. Alka had to push pots and pans and kettles aside like a curtain before he could put his head out to watch the wagon wheel. "Just shout 'whoa' whenever you see a wire going," the Tin Man instructed as he climbed back into his seat. "Will your horse hear me when everything's rattling and banging?" Alka asked doubtfully. Him? He could hear "whoa" 10 feet underwater, but "get up"? That he doesn't understand very well. "Get up," he told the horse. "If you do get a new wheel, may I have the old one?" Alka hastily bargained before the wagon could get into motion when the rattling of the tin would drown him out. "We'll have to see if my wife has little money left from last week. I sure didn't earn enough this week to buy as much as a spoke." "Get up," he told the horse again. "But what'll you do if your wife hasn't?" Alka asked. "It's sure you can't go on with this wheel next week." "Oh, I'll just throw it in the canal over Sunday to soak and swell. Then it's good for a couple days, and if we get some rain, that helps too. But this whole week was dry as cork." "Get up," the Tin Man patiently repeated. "But I'm afraid it's gone too far this time. I'm afraid even soaking it won't help." He spread his hands wide. "But what can you do without money?" "Get up, I said." The old horse seemed to sense that the conversation had definitely ended. He unwillingly got into bony, clumsy motion. The wagon creaked ahead. The tin began to jingle and rattle and jangle. Ness wasn't far, but even in that short distance, Alka became very handy at wrapping wires around the old, tired, warped wheel. He soon got so he could almost tell when a worn wire was going to snap. The old horse moved so slowly, Alka could give the wire a single wrap around the rim, wait for it to come back up again, and then twist it tightly into place. He seldom had to shout "whoa," but when he did, the old horse, in spite of all the jangling of the tin, stopped before the word was out of Alka's mouth. He almost seemed to know when Alka was starting to think "whoa." On the sharp gravel road, wires gave way right and left. Alka was busy as a bee, and it was sort of fun to see if he could get a wire around the rim without having to stop the old horse. Besides, there was the hope this might get him a wagon wheel for the roof of the school. You could never tell. It seemed more hopeful than going around to the farms. Not a farmer seemed to have a wheel that wasn't on a wagon. At last they rode down the cobbled streets of Ness. Alka took time from his busy wire twisting to look up at a huge white stork rising from the roof of a house. It flapped away as a second stork came winging back to the nest on the roof. The storks were already building nests in Ness. Alka had to tear his eyes away from the storks. Even in that brief time, 5 wires had broken loose from the rim. Alka had to shout to the horse. He replaced 3 of the wires. Then he noticed he had no more. The last wire had been used on the wheel. "No more wires," he told the Tin Man. "I'm all out." "So am I," the Tin Man said. "I gave you all the wires I had in the wagon, but it just has to hold to the end of the street. That's where I live." The wires didn't last. One after the other, they wore away on the cobblestones. Now, not a single wire was left. The iron rim threatened to ride right off the wheel. "How far yet?" Alka asked. The Tin Man stopped and looked at the wheel. Silently, he handed Alka a hammer he used in his trade. Would you walk behind the wagon and just pound the rim back whenever it starts to roll off? I'll try to pick out the smoothest places in the street. Auke jumped down and took the hammer. He pounded the rim back on the wheel. Go ahead now, he said. The wagon rolled ahead. The slow wheel, with Auke stalking beside it, hobbled over the cobblestones. Auke watched it like a hawk. And whenever the iron rim threatened to leave the wheel, he slapped it back with the hammer. To the tinny rattle of the pots and pans as the wagon bounced along the street was now added the hard sounds of Auke's constant hammering. It was a miserable din. Children along the street started to follow the wagon. The wagon stopped before a little house. They had arrived. On the stoop stood a woman, looking anxiously from her husband on the seat to Auke with the hammer. There were many little children around her, clutching her skirts and peeking shyly at Auke from behind her. She was holding a baby, but to Auke all the other children looked about the same size. The woman looked at her husband. "It's that bad, is it?" she said shrilly. The Tin Man nodded. "It means a new one this time, Auke. There's nothing else for it." "Did you make enough for a new one?" The Tin Man winced. "A bad week. Did you manage to keep anything over from last week?" he said timidly. His face flushed. "Over?" she said. "Over from last week?" She made a sweeping motion toward the children around her. "And Janie had to have the doctor." Even the children looked sad and unhappy. They looked as if they understood such things. It was clear enough that the Tin Man couldn't buy a new wheel. It made Auke feel sad and helpless and unhappy. For the Tin Man, for the wife, for all the children, and for himself. For it also meant no wheel for the school. "Could the cooper fix it for you?" Auke suggested helpfully. "He puts hoops around barrels and things. Maybe he could help make the rim stay on." The Tin Man and his wife looked startled. All the children stared, big-eyed. "Well, that's a new one," the Tin Man said. "That's one thing I haven't tried yet. I've had it at the blacksmith off and on, but I can't take it there again without money." "The cooper," he repeated, consideringly. "That shouldn't cost too much." He looked at his wife. "I hope so. I hope not," she said softly. "Otherwise, maybe we'd better just pray. That's still free." She looked defiantly at Auke. "Guess I'd better go now," Auke said awkwardly. He did not know what else to say or what else to do. He handed the Tin Man his hammer, but did not look at him. It was all so sad and hopeless. It made Auke feel full of lumps and unhappiness. There wasn't a thing he could do. "Thanks for helping," the Tin Man said, "and I only wish I could give you the wheel." Oh, that's all right," Auke said. It was sort of fun." But that wasn't the right thing to say. "In a way," he added clumsily. Then he turned on his heels and ran. It was such a relief to run away from the unhappiness that Auke ran harder and harder. The storks stopped him. There the two storks were again, on the same house they had passed with the wagon. Both of them were coming down now with reeds in their bills, big as life, flapping low now, settling on the wheel on the roof, huge, white, wonderful, big as life. Auke stood staring up at them, open-mouthed. Eyes on the stork, head thrown back, all absorbed, Auke edged into the little yard alongside the house. Now the storks were right above him on the roof. He felt almost as if he could reach up and touch them. A poorly placed twig fell from the great sprawly nest on the wagon wheel, rattled down the roof, and landed at Auke's feet. Auke picked it up and drew his arm back to toss it up to the storks. A woman rapped sharply on the window pane. Auke dropped his hand. The woman shoved the window open. "What are you doing in my yard?" she demanded. "Who gave you permission?" Auke brought his eyes down from the storks and became aware of the stick he was still holding. "Oh," he confusedly explained. They just dropped this down the roof and I was going to toss it back." He dropped the stick. "You're a stranger here, aren't you?" the woman said. "Do you always walk right into people's yards?" "Oh, no," Auke said, "but there were the storks." "I did walk right in here, didn't I?" "Yes, and you must have unlatched the gate to do it." Auke managed a little apologetic laugh. I guess I did, but I didn't know it. You see, there were the storks so close, and in Shora we don't have storks at all, and you have them on your roof." The woman smiled at Auke's excited interest in her storks. "Well, they're on the roof every year, and I guess one gets sort of used to them. Still, if you've never had a stork in your village, I suppose it's exciting." "Every year?" Auke said, wonder in his voice. "And in Shora... Say," he suddenly said, "are you maybe Lena's aunt? I go to school with Lena, and she wrote a story about what you told her about storks, and now we're all trying to find a wheel to put on our school to make storks come to Shora. That's why I'm way out here in Ness." "Well now, think of that," the woman said. "And Lena started it all? But, boy, I'm afraid it'll do no good to look for a wheel in Ness. Every spare wheel in Ness goes up on the roof every spring. Why, it's almost part of spring house cleaning. You just noticed mine because mine already has storks. I always get the first storks in Ness. But nearly every house has a wheel up on the roof, as you can see. In fact, they're all up, except the one across the street. Everett is getting that up today. At least I see he's got the ladder up against the house. But Everett is always late. He's too fussy. He even paints his wheel." She stuck her head out of the window to look at the house across the street. Auke followed her gaze. An oldish man was coming around the house rolling a wheel toward the ladder. "Look at that," Lena's aunt exclaimed scornfully. "He's even gone patriotic this year and painted it red, white, and blue. At least other years he had just one color, and even then he never got a stork. Storks don't like all that bright color. It scares them away. But you can't tell Everett anything, the stubborn old fool." Across the street, the old man had begun to shove the wheel up the ladder. It was a big, heavy-looking, solid wheel, and Everett was having a struggle. The sheer weight of the wheel seemed to make it hard for him to get his foot on the next higher rung of the ladder. "He'll never make it," Auke said to Lena's aunt. "Maybe I'd better give him a hand." Old Everett had stopped halfway up the ladder to rest. Now he stared up at the length of ladder and the steep pitch of roof still ahead of him. He looked around helplessly. His eyes fell on Auke. "Hey, boy!" he yelled. "Want to earn 2.5 cents helping me get this wheel on the roof? I'll give you half a nickel." "Sure," Auke said promptly. Half a nickel was not just to be picked up every day, and he'd been going to do it for nothing. "Bye, Lena's aunt," he said hastily and turned to the street. He remembered to close the gate. "You can tell the old fool for me," Lena's aunt said softly. "He's wasting his money and his strength. Storks won't settle on a wheel that's lit up like a lighthouse." Auke didn't intend to say anything that might make him lose the surprise offer of 2.5 cents. He sprinted across the street. "What do you want me to do?" he asked Everett from the foot of the ladder. "Get the other ladder that's behind the house and set it up next to mine. Then we can both push the wheel up. You can handle a ladder, can't you?" For 2.5 cents, Auke would have been willing to try to handle 2.5 ladders. He hustled. He struggled the ladder up against the house, slid it tightly against Everett's ladder, then he climbed up and took hold of the wheel. That helps, Everett breathed gratefully as he felt the strain ease. Just so once we get it on the edge of the roof. Alka looked at the heavy, solid wheel, looked up at the long pitch of the tile roof, looked back at the solid wheel again, and then it struck him. What a work for nothing, he said. What do you mean for nothing? I'm paying you, ain't I? You're doing it for nothing, Alka said pointedly. Lena's aunt says that you'll never get storks on a wheel that's painted red, white, and blue like a flag on a lighthouse, and she ought to know. He nodded toward the roof across the street. Everett looked at the roof across the street. With enormous flappings of its huge wings, a stork with a twig crosswise in its bill was just then settling down on the rim of the wheel. See that? Alka said. Sure, I see it, Everett said testily, but they'll land on mine just as well once we get it up. The bright paint will keep them away, Alka said knowingly. What you need, he pursued relentlessly, is an old beat-up wheel, just so it'll hold storks. Lena's aunt's is just an old wheel. Oh, so, Everett said. Well, all I've got is a good, solid painted wheel, and they'll take it or leave it. They'll leave it, Alka said promptly, and next fall you'll just have to haul it down again. What a work! I called you over here to help me, not to give me an argument, Everett said sourly. If I didn't have to stand here arguing and holding up a heavy wheel at the same time, I'd give you a good sound swat around the ears. No, but, Alka said, I mean, I know where you can get just the wheel you need, good and old, and it doesn't have one speck of paint on it. It's even more beat up than Lena's aunt's. He put his shoulder under the wheel and took most of its weight so he could carefully explain to Everett about the Tin Man and his hopeless wheel. He can't go out with it again, Alka finished in all earnestness, no matter how long he soaks it in the canal. The man looked at him oddly. Say, you're a funny kid, bothering your head about other people's troubles. The Tin Man has always had troubles and always will with that house full of kids. But those are his troubles, not yours or mine. No, but, Alka persisted, if he had your wheel, he could use his wagon. And if you had his, you'd get storks. Everett looked at him hard. Say, are you sure Lena's aunt isn't your aunt? You worry so about other people's business, you must be related. Alka stubbornly tried a new tack. Tomorrow is Sunday. If you don't get your wheel up today, you won't get at it again until Monday, and you're way late as it is. Lena's aunt's storks are already nesting. Meaning what? Everett demanded. I don't think I'll help you get it up, Alka said determinedly. Then you don't get your 2.5 cents. No, but you won't get your storks. You won't anyway on a painted wheel, but... Oh, all right, Everett said. You're the most persistent, queer kid I've ever seen. But it's less work to give in to you than to stand on a ladder, holding a wheel and arguing with you. Help me slide it down. Alka grabbed the wheel. When they had it resting against the foot of the ladder, he kept an eye on the man, expecting to get a hard box on the ear at any moment. Everett grumbled to himself. Perfectly sound wheel for an old beat-up thing, he muttered. But then the Tin Man wouldn't have a red cent to pay me to boot. He came to a decision. All right, he said to Alka. Roll it away and come back with the other. I'll give it a try. She across the street isn't going to rub my nose in it every year and every year again. Beat it. Alka jumped to take the wheel. I'll be right back, and then I'll help you put the old wheel up. It'll be much lighter. You'll see you'll get storks, and storks bring all kinds of good luck, he promised in grateful excitement. Well, they're bringing the Tin Man some, Everett said. Beat it before I change my mind. Alka rolled the wheel away. As he came down the street, Alka saw that the Tin Man, his wife, and all the little children were still around the wagon. The Tin Man was working on the old wheel. Alka couldn't wait. I got?" he yelled down the street. He rolled the wheel wildly toward the astonished group around the wagon. "We've got to get your old one off the axle right away, and then I've got to take it to Everett up the street," he explained. "We better work fast." "Everett?" The Tin Man couldn't believe it. "Everett must be getting soft in the head," he told his wife. They stood there, awed by the glazed red, white, and blue wheel. "I can explain while we change the wheel," Auka said. "We better do it quick. Everett might change his mind." Now the Tin Man sprang into action, and with Auka jabbering excitedly beside him, he soon had the wagon jacked up. The old wheel had been off the axle so often it practically fell off the moment the big nut that held it in place had been removed. Auka and the Tin Man slid the new wheel on the axle. The Tin Man had to step back a moment to admire the wheel. Auka twisted the nut into place and gave it a last hard turn with the wagon wrench. The Tin Man wasn't satisfied but had to give it another turn. Then he stepped back again. With the new wheel in place, he at last seemed to be able to begin to believe his good luck. He rushed to the old wheel and heaved it on the wagon. "Everybody on the wagon," he shouted. "All you kids, every last one. We're going to take this boy back to Shora in state on the wagon. You get on the wagon and catch them as I toss them up to you," he excitedly ordered Auka. Auka caught children as they came up to him and deposited them around his feet among the tin in the bottom of the wagon. Even the Tin Man's wife had to climb up on the high seat with the baby and share in the ride of triumph. "We'll first ride up to Everett's to thank him and help him get the old wheel on the roof. Then on to Shora," the Tin Man said. "Here's hoping Everett gets some storks on the old wheel. He's never had one, but I'll get him some storks if I have to catch them and tie them to Everett's wheel," he promised. Everybody laughed happily at his excitement. The wagon clattered and rattled and jangled to Everett's house. In all the excited talk of the thankful Tin Man, Everett wasn't given much chance to change his mind or even to think. With Everett watching in confusion, Auka and the Tin Man swarmed up the ladders with the wheel. Even the steep roof seemed no problem to the Tin Man. He could have climbed walls and walked on clouds. In no time at all, the wheel was fastened to the brackets on the ridge of the roof. "There now, Everett," the Tin Man shouted down jubilantly. "If the good Lord doesn't send you a couple of storks for such a good deed, as he will, I'll get them for you in person." "Tin ones?" Everett said sourly. "No, good, lucky, live ones, just like those." He pointed to the nest on Lena's aunt's house. "You'll see. You'll see. Suddenly he was staring up into the sky. He pointed. "There they come! There they come now! Get me down from here! Get the ladders down! Here come Everett's storks!" Because he was so sure, everyone believed him. They hardly gave him time to scramble down the ladder. Even the Tin Man's wife helped to pull the ladders down, and they hastily laid them on the ground. Two of the children who had climbed out of the wagon were tossed back in again. The wife wasn't given time to get into the high seat. "Just run alongside for a minute. I've got to get all the shiny tin away from Everett's house. It mustn't scare the storks," the Tin Man said from his seat. Auka and the wife trotted beside the wagon. 6 houses beyond Everett's, the wagon stopped. The Tin Man's wife got up into the high seat. Auka handed her the baby and climbed up after her. The Tin Man's eyes were fixed on the sky. In the wagon box, the little children stared solemnly into the sky. "Got to get this wagon still farther away," the Tin Man muttered. "All this shiny, jangling tin." They rattled farther down the street. Everybody stared up at the 2 flying storks. The storks were circling high over nests. Back at the house, Everett was crouched behind a bush, straining up, not moving a hair. The circling storks dipped lower, and then still lower. "I'd hate myself," the Tin Man muttered, "if I scared those storks away." He clucked frantically to the horse. The old horse sensed the urgency in his voice. The wagon rattled out of nests and on to Shora. And there we leave Auka And our next chapter, we are going to pick up where we left off with Lena as she walks along the dike road. The dike is that long ridge that separates the land from the water, the North Sea. So we'll find out what happens next chapter in The Wheel on the School. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye now.